Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing First Reformed. This film was written and directed by Paul Schrader. It's very gray outside today, and I'm wearing gray in honor of this film because it is very dark, very brooding, one of those movies that just has an air of malaise about it. Paul Schrader has had quite an up and down career as a director. His work has been a little bit spotty, but as a writer, he's written some of the great American anti-hero allegories that really did resonate with the culture. It just kind of seeped into the American consciousness, and they endure brilliantly today, many of them. Some of his most prominent works have been with Martin Scorsese. He wrote Raging Bull, Last Temptation of Christ, and of course, Taxi Driver, which to me felt very much like a Dostoevsky kind of crime and punishment film for the modern day in the 70s. It's basically a perfect script, that one, and I think it's one of the great American films. It may be maybe my favorite Scorsese film ever. And I would say First Reformed is very much like Taxi Driver. It's just maybe more for the modern day. And then, of course, it has a completely different story, completely different context, but the themes are still there and they still resonate. But as I said, it's totally different story here. You know, in Taxi Driver, you have this kind of brooding taxi driver who's a post-Vietnam vet, obviously dealing with a lot of trauma there. All that existential angst is just simmering inside of him. It's like this coiled tension, and that is what's so exciting. And I would say there are many comparisons I could draw between that character and then the main character in this film. In this film, it's a pastor played by Ethan Hawke. The character's name is Toller. His church is called the First Reform, and it's in Albany, New York. Like many protagonists in a story like this, he deals with a lot of past demons. His son was killed in Iraq, and that kind of caused his marriage to deteriorate over time, and he lives with that sense of guilt and melancholy kind of all the time. But what I really love about this character is just his demeanor, because it's not what you'd expect. A lot of it, of course, is in the writing, but a lot of it also is in the way that Ethan Hawke plays the character. I think Hawke is one of our great American actors, and I think that he gives Toller this sort of quiet patience and sensitivity. He doesn't appear to be angry or violent like you'd expect. He's actually a very kind man, somebody who seems very interested, and he writes in a journal about all of this dread that he feels, trying to make sense of the emotion that he's experiencing and how it's slowly causing him to spiral downward. He's attentive, and he's got sort of a paternal quality, and there's true humanity there, and I think that that's what's key about the character. It's that great dichotomy of wanting to make the world a better place, to help the cause and maintain that sense of hope, even though the world just seems so helpless a lot of the time. And that's kind of the crux of the film. In the beginning of the movie, he meets with a pregnant woman named Mary and her husband at church. Her husband is kind of a radical environmental activist, somebody that, of course, really cares about climate change and all of the more resonant political issues that are so prominent in the modern world. He meets with the husband separately, and that meeting really gets to him, and it is sort of his call to adventure. He looks at the husband and he sees somebody who has such great despair, even though he fights so valiantly for a cause that he believes in. But at the same time, he feels such despair that he's basically ready to give up on the world. This conversation just really resonates with Toller, and I think that it's mainly because he's the kind of person who has his foot in two different worlds. Of course, he's got his foot in the religion world very, very deeply. And that's, of course, a world that is at least attempting to bring people together, to maintain a sort of moral compass. But of course, a lot of these methods are being brought into question more and more, and I think that he can really feel this very strongly. Wanting to have that safety net of religion that he has, but yet there's also that sense of that nihilism inside of him, and it's like a splinter. And because this is set in the modern day, you get that feeling that this is the modern day. We live in a world currently where everything just feels out of balance. Ethics and morality are shifting all the time, and all kinds of things are being brought into question in ways that they hadn't been before. And I think that this movie, in a lot of ways, reflects a lot of that disorientation. And it looks very old. It looks kind of has that classic timeless quality to it. And that feeling to me just was kind of the sense of an old world that's slowly decaying. A great example of this would be the church itself, the First Reformed Church, which is very rooted in history. It's an old church, and so few people go to church anymore, and he kind of has to entertain the small group of tourists that will come and learn about the church. There's, of course, this gift shop where you can buy items, and he really resents a lot of this. He resents kind of the decaying moral values in many ways, but he also resents the rise of the political culture in the midst of all these rising corporations. And all of these ideas and events that happen to him are sort of getting trapped in this cerebral web of his. And there is a line in the movie, I'm gonna get it wrong. I don't remember it exactly. I just remember it was something along the lines of, we don't want experiences, we'd rather just have the emotions associated with it. And I really like that line. I feel like it really, it helps us understand that kind of psychological warfare that we're constantly grappling with. And of course, somebody like Schrader, the writer, is constantly grappling with, because these themes are reflected in so many of his works. But feeling versus reason is the great dichotomy of humanity in many ways. And I think that this movie tries to contemplate that, of course. And we see, like I mentioned at the beginning, we see a lot of that echoing in what we saw in Taxi Driver. There's even a moment that's a direct callback to that movie. It's the moment where Toller is pouring the Pepto-Bismol into the whiskey glass and it kind of zooms in. That's the same as that moment where Travis is looking at the water and the Alka-Seltzer dissolving in it, and there's that zoom in, the same one. And this film is very stylistic, it has to be mentioned. It's a movie that does feel like a genre piece. It's kind of bombastic in a lot of ways. It feels kind of part psychological drama, part horror film, and even a dash of satire. There is a part of it that feels very implausible, and even though there's a lot of realism in it, there's something about it that does kind of feel as though it's not real, that it is a fantasy. And there is, of course, a hint of surrealism in it as well. But it does feel like a movie that was made in the past. There are a lot of touches of, like, Carl Dreyer is one that I kept thinking about, who is like one of my favorite directors of all time. So anytime I see anybody doing anything that is reminiscent of that, I get excited. And then, of course, Ingmar Bergman as well. This is a movie that's very much rooted in film history in a lot of ways, yet it's also dealing a lot with the things that are happening in the changing world. But it does have a timeless quality, and just that feeling of coldness that is constantly unsettling. There's an emptiness as well. But you've got all of these contributing factors that are attempting to come to terms with the meaning of existence and the failings of humanity. And it's walking that tightrope between the hope and the despair constantly. And the ending, while I don't want to get into too many specifics about it, I have a feeling that a lot of people are torn, because I kind of got that sense when I was in the movie theater, kind of listening to the reactions of the audience. And I kind of feel the same way. Part of me feels like it does get a little bit messy, that it lacks some cohesion compared to something like Taxi Driver. It feels a little less assured of itself in terms of how it arrives at the conclusions or lack thereof. But at the same time, I think that is part of its power in a lot of ways. The final image really stayed with me because it is, to me, so much about deep pain, deep emotion, and caring in the midst of chaos, in the midst of all of this pain and loss. But it's wrapped up in this sort of ecstasy. It's like the ecstasy that is bleeding through the blackness. And that, to me, while I'm not sure if it works overall, I keep thinking about it, and maybe after I see it again, my feelings on it might change. I don't know. But as it stands, I really adore this film. I know I haven't seen that many movies this year, but I definitely think this is my favorite one of the year so far. Schrader proved that he hasn't lost any of what made him a great artist in the first place, and I think that's really important, and I think that people need to see it. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.